Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me okay? For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Chris Orme. I'm the head of the School of Social Sciences, which occupies the Arthur Lewis building. And it's my great pleasure to welcome here this evening Danny Dorling to give our second annual Arthur Lewis public lecture. Danny is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford, having previously had academic positions at Newcastle, Bristol, Leeds, and Sheffield, where he was the Professor for the Public Understanding of Social Sciences. He's published widely with colleagues on issues relating to social inequalities in Britain and has been described as many things, including the geographer royal by appointment to the left. Many of his articles and publications are available via open access and or on his own personal website, which I have no intention of publicising further this evening. I'm delighted to welcome Danny to Manchester to give this evening's talk. He's told me that he'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and we'll take questions and answers after that. The title of his talk is Inequality and Understanding the Danger of Idiots. Would you please give a warm Manchester welcome to Professor Danny Dorling?
Thank you ever so much. It's a great honour to be asked to do this lecture in particular. I should apologise for the title. I was in Greece at the time I was asked to do the lecture, and I was having a discussion with some friends, and they actually told me that the word private sector in Greece translates literally as idiot sector. And I thought this was quite funny. They didn't think it's funny because it's just what the word has always been in Greek. The word private and idiot is the same word. I'll tell you about the derivation of it in a minute. But to give you an example, shortly after the University of Manchester put this talk up on the website, I received an email. And this is what the email read. Hi, I hope this email finds you well. Are you in charge of event organisation for inequality and the understanding of the danger of idiots? I'm not sure if you're the right person to speak to. I was a researcher and computer scientist at USD and started a company to provide mobile apps to help, and it goes on and on and on. It's spam. And clearly what somebody has done is write a computer program which just goes across university websites looking for talks that are being announced, picks out the title of the talk, puts it into an email and sends you spam, because even if only 1 in 1,000 persons replies, their company might make some money. But obviously that creates a lot of grief. It doesn't help people very much if many people behave like that, which is why we have spam filters. And this is the kind of balance I want to talk about. I'm also going to do a little advert for geography. This is the macroscope, is the picture. If any of you know your Ronald Dahl, I'm afraid it wasn't invented by a geographer. It's a big friendly giant. But this idea of rather than looking in detail and zooming down on something to try to understand it, zoom out and look as wide as you can to begin to understand what may be going on. The word idiot just meant private. It meant somebody who didn't want to partake in the new democracy that was happening in Athens. Somebody who said, you lot meeting in that square and all shouting at each other for all those hours are just wasting your time. If we all get on with our own thing individually, it'll work out for the best. And there is no, other way of it working. Or just, I can't be bothered to take part. Now, clearly, the idiots in Athens lost. Athens got its democracy and actually got a word christened after a group of people who were particularly selfish. But this is an age-old dilemma. You can see it in the beginnings of almost all world religions. Most world religions began at a time of great inequality when a few people were grabbing too much, and they were a response to that. You lay down a set of rules that basically says don't be too greedy, worry about your neighbours, these kind of things. Some books. The less rude version of what I have to say is in these books. But it really is about the same thing. Now, obviously, there's a tension because the alternative to people just doing their own thing individually could be a kind of Stalinist bureaucracy, which is just as bad, just as much greed, just as much damage being caused by a few people. Could be university professors who think they're ever so clever that they can work out ways of forming committees that are going to organise everything. But the Escher picture at the bottom is showing you we do have to find ways of getting on with each other. Geographically is the most obvious reason. You can't just build a house somewhere and not have an effect on other people. If you decide that you want to buy some flats in London and leave them empty as an investment, that does have an effect on other people in London when they're trying to find somewhere to live. This is the cover we didn't choose for the Inequality in the 1% book, which I kind of wish we had chosen. And there is a reason for it, I suppose, going back to Oxford, where I was in Oxford in the 1980s when I saw undergraduates running around, not actually in pig masks, but being a bit atrocious. And you knew that there were a group of undergraduates. I was a child, by the way. I didn't go to university. I was at school. You knew there were a group who fervently believed in what Margaret Thatcher was trying to do because it was new. This is the early 1980s. I'm taking you back a long time. And it was their dream that something had gone badly, badly wrong. Their families were a lot poorer than they had been. The wealth of their parents and their grandparents had been enormous compared to their wealth in the 1970s and 1980s. Britain had been great once. It had ruled the world. You know, great-great-granddad might have even had plantations. And now where were we? We were the sick man of Europe. It was terrible. You needed to try something else. And in a way, what we're seeing now is the end of that experiment. And you can see, apart from the silly masks, you could see back then, because you hadn't tested it, you didn't know whether this might work. Margaret Thatcher really believed it would work. Letting people and their families control their own destiny, saying there's no such thing as society, would help. Would make the world a much better place, and in particular Britain a better place. She signed up to the World Health Organization's target for health inequalities to halve them by the year 2000, fully believing that a freer society would be a healthier society and there would be less health inequality because clearly health can rise more easily amongst those at the bottom than those who are already living the longest. As it happens, we completely missed those targets. Our health inequalities rose greatly. I often worry that people have seen this graph before. You may well have seen it before, but I'm amazed how many people don't know about the graph. It's the take of the 1%. The top line is the take before tax. As a proportion of all income, the bottom line is the take after tax. And this is the graph for the UK, or for Britain. All rich countries in the world 100 years ago were very unequal. They all had a small elite who had a high proportion of income and had servants. They had a lot of people with very little income. And then all rich countries in the world became progressively more equal after the First World War. Half the equality that we finally gained was won by 1939. It was cemented after the Second World War. Taxes were raised. That's why you see the bottom line go down further, because that's the income after tax. And when you raise taxes on the rich, it has a wonderful effect of helping them not try to get as much money. It doesn't raise you more money. It stops people who are very well paid trying to get even more because they're just going to end up paying more in tax, which leaves more money for everybody else. So we got to a point by the 1970s when I was that child in Oxford wondering what was going on down on the high street, where the best off 1% of people in the country only took 6% of all income. That means, you know, a banker getting £150,000 today as opposed to an average wage of 25,000, those kind of gaps. And after tax, it was only 4 times. And then from the late 1970s onwards, you get this relentless rise in inequality. It goes up and up and up. and then something may be happening now. If you factor in tax dodging, the 1% now take about 15% of all income. But the fascinating thing is that that rise didn't occur everywhere. The fall occurred everywhere. And if the fall had occurred everywhere, we couldn't compare different places to see what's going on because it was the same thing. But we got one of the largest rises, and other countries didn't get that. Some good news, because we often forget the good news. Lots of inequalities have fallen. How we treat people by varying sexualities has changed dramatically. If you ever think change can't happen, just think about Clause 28 and how teachers could be found guilty of mentioning the fact that people could be gay not too long ago, and now you can get married. Or think about things like caning, corporal punishment. It's amazing how fast something which was seen as normal and good for discipline when I was a child becomes child abuse by the time my children are my age. Things can change. The gap between men and women has fallen in many ways. It's still too large. We have Greens now. We're becoming a normal European country in terms of having we still don't have a normal European-sized Green Party, but we're kind of getting there. I think, although Andrew disagrees with me, I think we may be getting a Labour Party that just looks like a normal mass European socialist party. But it's a bit of a shock for us because we haven't had that for some time. I also think, my friend from Germany took this picture, which is UKIP. The rise of UKIP is actually a sign of becoming more European. Any decent, normally sized European country has a far-right, slightly nutty party. It's not... Also, he didn't deliberately take a picture of people who are slightly larger than average, but we'll get on to that later. Look at the little boy looking a bit disconcerted. That was just in rural Oxfordshire a few months ago. I should have said, we don't have a Conservative Party. That's the one thing we're lacking. A normal European country has a Conservative Party that joins in with the other Conservative parties in Europe. We don't have one of those. We have a Conservative Party that joins in with some very strange people, indeed. But there are lots of things that are getting better. Social scientists tend to concentrate on the things which are getting worse. And what's interesting is how things are getting worse in the south of the country as well as the north. The north-south divide is now becoming a chasm. It's growing so quickly and so widely, it's not interesting anymore for people to study and measure, because in some ways it's too obvious. But in the south, in London, you're seeing the private sector in rental accommodation grow by 1% every year since the millennium. If it carries on, by 2050, everybody's in rented, and a few landlords are really cashing in very well. It's a dramatic change. A quarter of all families with children in England, largely in the south of England, are now in the private rented sector. This is very bad news for the families because they can be chucked out with about 2 months' notice. And children don't like losing their friends. They get really upset about it. Even the geographer can work that out. They don't like moving schools. There's nothing wrong in having a private rental sector, but good private rental sectors are regulated so that people can stay in their property for a bit longer, so that the rent can't zoom up. Right? But if you believe that regulation is bad, if you've done the standard American or English Economics 101 course, where all students are told that rent control creates slums, complete and utter stupid lie. Right? But that's what we've been teaching people for 40 years. It just doesn't, you just need to know a little bit of history to know rent control. Or just go to Berlin now, or anywhere else in Germany now, or to the Netherlands, or even to parts of the US where they have rent control. So some things that are very bad. The tadpole philosophy, which was christened when we were last as unequal as now by Tawney, is the idea you have a load of people down there renting privately in London. They've all done well in Manchester. They've got 2 1s first. They've gone and got a master's because mum and dad has helped out and paid for that. They've done really well, and they've managed to get the job in publishing or in finance, and they're all down in London because that's where all the graduate jobs now are. I'm exaggerating slightly, but the bulk of the new full-time secure jobs are there. And you tell them all, as you're sitting there as your big fat frog on the rock in the head of that publishing company, being the only person over the age of 45 in the building and being male, You tell them, oh, if you just behave like me, if you work like me, you'll be okay. And what the tadpoles don't realise is that there's only so much space on the rock, and there are a lot of tadpoles. Yeah, you just cannot all get onto a rock if you arrange your society in that kind of a way. This is the most complicated graph I'm going to show you, but it's just zooming out with data. You can't see what it's showing. That is age from age 18 down to 90, and these are years from 83 to 2012. This is the British Social Attitude Survey. It's not a very big survey, so it's looking a bit blurred, but taken almost every year. And the red is where you've got majority private renting. And this is people in their 50s and 60s. Again, when I was a child, majority private renting, council houses and the end of private tenure, and it disappears. This green diagonal is the owner-occupied revolution. That's when it became possible to buy a house. Those terrible, awful years in the 1970s when you could get a mortgage at the age of 25 and settle down and have a baby. You know, that awful, awful decade when that was possible is in the middle of it. And what you can just about see here is the beginnings again of mass private renting, zooming up the age scales and people beginning to realise at 34, 35, 36, unless they've got very rich grandparents or parents, doesn't matter how well they do, if they're in the south of England, they're always going to be paying money to a landlord. Rents are twice a mortgage. Right, so it's not just the insecurity, you're actually paying twice as much every month for the benefit of something of much lower quality and a lack of security where you are. And the fear is that that stripe carries on. And that wasn't the plan. The plan was a property-owning democracy, but we didn't get it. And we didn't get it, I think, partly because our politics shifted at the same time as our inequalities rose. So we ended up with this kind of message, that the parties supported by and bankrolled by people way off on this side. The Conservatives really are the party of the 1%. Labour were the party of most of the rest of the top 10%. If you actually looked at the incomes of the people involved, they got better and better and better off. All three of our party leaders were well in the 1% at the last election, partly thanks to their wives earning more than them. And you had the ridiculous situation of arguments about the fact that Ed Miliband had 2 kitchens, and then it turned out David Cameron had 3 kitchens, but one for the servants. But, you know, it's a strange point to get to. If you want to get depressed, and I can talk about it later, that's the United States student loan bubble. In unequal countries, you get student loans. In more equal countries, you decide collectively to fund children and young adults' education rather than do it alone, because you see each other as more similar. In the UK, if you're up here, you don't want these people going to university. Or if they're going to go, they can at least pay for it. You've been paying for your children's education anyway, since they were 4 or even 3. And you can just pay that £9,000 as a cheque. There's no loan. For the 1%, they don't have student loans. They simply pay the fees. They don't face the idea of £70,000 or £150,000 return if they are mildly successful or mediumly successful in the labour market. So of course student loans in Britain were attractive to the people who decided to bring them in, because they were never going to have them. Other things go dramatically wrong as you become more unequal. This is a graph from Becky Tunstall, who's at the University of York, and I'll just tell you about the top line. The top line is the ratio of rooms per person in the best housed tenth of the population to the worst housed tenth of the population. So the 10th who've got the most space and the 10th who've got the least space. Now, we start off in 1911. It's all census data. People were more crowded in 1911 overall, but the best off 10th had 4 times more rooms than the worst off 10th of the population. The worst off 10th were a family into a room, and then in the next room in your 2-bed tenement there was another family, but 4 times. Inequality increased in 1921 in terms of housing, and then got steadily and steadily better to the heady socialist days of the 1970s and 80s when inequality was still threefold, 3 times more rooms per person, the best off compared to the worst off. And then the most incredible thing happened. This enormous rise in inequality. It's not just income inequality turning into wealth inequality and more people being able to afford 2 or 3 houses and other people having to squeeze into whatever they can do. It's also aging. We have a housing system which worked pretty well as long as you die around about the age of 74 and leave that 3-bed semi-empty. If you head off into your late 80s and late 90s, and if you have an individualistic ethos that says there's no such thing but people and their families, then you rattle around in your 3-bed semi on your own so that when you die, you can give the maximum amount of money to your kids. Individually, very good for a middle-class household. In aggregate, a complete disaster, having lots of people in very large houses. If you look at the loneliness statistics about the elderly, and if you survey the elderly, they say, I'd like to be in something smaller. They actually say it, partly because they're having to heat these houses, and for some reason, elderly people seem more worried about cleaning houses than other people and feel the need to do it. You know, there are a lot of things we could sort out with what we've already got. But we can't do it with the levels of inequality we've got. When you talk about the 1%, it's not an us and them situation, because there's more inequality in the 1% than there is in the other 99%. The 1% are not a solid block who are that well organised. I can get in trouble with some people about this who believe the word and the truth and the light of Karl Marx and, you know, the ruling upper elite work together. But it's amazing to see just what the differences are. If you're wondering if you're in the 1%, I won't ask you to out yourself. You can come and tell me later if you want. If your household income is about 160,000 a year and you don't have any kids, you just get in it. If you've got kids, you need about 200,000 a year. 2 of you getting 100 grand a year. A couple of doctors would just about do it, but they've got to live together. What this is showing you is the other end. This is the Sunday Times Rich List, which tells you about the 1,000 richest families in the country. And these are the richest 10 in London. And they're each getting a circle equal to the size of their wealth. And they have a quarter of all the wealth of the richest 500 families. So you could get yourself in the Sunday Times Rich List and actually not feel that you've done very well. You're not really rich. You've only got a few millions. You know, not tens and tens of millions. And certainly you're not like these people. If you had the next 3 families, which I won't say why I don't, it's not mine, and this is the problem about Britain. You know, wealth is tricky. If you have the next 3, they actually have a third, I think, of all income. That's where the wealth of the Sunday Times Rich List is. I'm only going to show you one map like this. I've got loads of maps like this, which perhaps for a talk in the North, I should have had more of them. Arts Council funding, that kind of thing. You know, you end up with a real concentration of money in one place. But these are just the richest 1,000 families. You've got over 500,000 people in the 1%. If you're at the bottom of the 1%, say you're 2 doctors getting 90, 100 grand in London, you've got a joint income of about 170, 180, and you want to buy a 3-bed semi, and you want to buy it in an average borough, you can't get a mortgage because it's going to cost you, for a 3-bed semi, £750,000 in an average borough. In the posh bit of North Oxford, it's 800,000 for a 2-bed terrace. Right? So you don't feel that well off at the bottom of the 1% if that's where you are. And the 1% have become more and more concentrated in London and the South East. The 1% used to be spread out across the country. You always have a 1%, but they used to contain head teachers, individual doctors, only a few bankers. Now the vast majority of the 1% work in finance and banking. We have over 2,200 bankers paid over €1 million a year. The next highest number in Europe is 197 in Germany. If anybody tells you that if you try to reduce inequalities, the financiers will leave, you've got to ask them where are they going to go. The only place they can go is New York, maybe Singapore. But the Americans are not going to resign their jobs to create 2,000 vacancies at $1.5, $2, $3 million a year for some Brits who are getting a bit sulky, because they are still going to be the richest people, but not quite as rich. Just going to do some geographical comparisons from you, because I really don't want to go over time, because I'm interested in what you think about these things. That's a map of the world, of the whole world, drawn in proportion to population. It's my only attempt to show I haven't forgotten that there is the rest of the world. But for the rest of the lecture, I'm only going to talk about the 25 richest countries in the world. If you draw it this way, by the way, suddenly we're not in the middle. We're a slightly insignificant 1% of the population on the edge, or just 0.5% of all children. That's how we're slowing down. Okay, a 1% graph again. I showed you the UK one before, which is that. What you can now see is the American one. So we don't think we're weird because the Americans are more unequal. If you're very good at looking at lines very quickly, what you may notice is that for large European countries in the 1970s and 80s, we were the second most equal to Sweden. We are the most amazingly interesting natural experiment. We've gone and fallen on our sword for the good of social science. Some country had to do the thing of saying, what happens if you go from being one of the most equal countries to the most unequal country in Europe? What are the outcomes? And if it hadn't happened, if you hadn't got this fanning out of things, we wouldn't be able to tell. And of course, you can't still tell. These are correlations, but you do not get correlations just by coincidence, and we're getting too many of them. I'll do this very quickly. This is the league table 5 years ago for inequality in the rich world. The most equal country is Japan. The best off 10th in Japan still have 4.5 times more than the worst off 10th. None of this is about equality. It's about degrees of inequality. And then you have, very nicely lined up, your Scandinavian countries. Then you have Germany, which is not an economic basket case. Then Austria, then Slovenia, South Korea, Denmark, Belgium, and Switzerland, which is slightly more equal than average for the richest 25 countries. The 1% in Switzerland have half as much income as the 1% in Britain. People take salaries that are half as much for an average financial job in Zurich. And they're still fairly good at doing that job. Then France, Netherlands, Ireland, Canada, and these are all the normal countries. This is normal for the best off 10th to have 10 times the income of the worst 10th of households. And then finally you get up to Italy, New Zealand, Australia, you begin to get English-speaking countries. Israel, which you'll be aware, Israel is a very unequal country, but I'll say no more about Israel because you have to vet people who speak about Israel now if they come to speak at universities. And then us. And we have a greater degree of economic inequality than Israel. And then above us, Portugal, the United States, and Singapore. Portugal's now dropped down. So we're now third. And we are remarkably unequal. Our poorest 20% are the poorest 20% absolutely in Western Europe. The median family in Britain gets 5,000 or 6,000 euros less a year to live on than a median family in France and Germany. When somebody wants to tell you that the French don't know how to run an economy, you need to ask them, why does the middle family do so much better? And that is before they pay for housing. It is remarkable, I think, what we don't know. This, I'll leave it up for a second for people who are particularly nerdy or worried that I fixed my stats. The table is showing you those figures updated for 5 years. And if you're very interested in this, some countries should drop out. The countries in Europe which have done very badly economically actually drop out of the richest 25, and some oil states just about move in. Kuwait, UAE, Hong Kong, Qatar will jump in. But the order doesn't change very much in general, except that our inequality has risen on a par with Israel there, and it's actually going up faster than it's going up in Singapore and the US. Because Obama has managed to raise taxes in the US on the rich, not very much, but he's done it. And in Singapore, they brought in capital controls because they were worried after 2008 that Chinese investors with lots of money might buy flats and leave them empty in Singapore. And they changed the law 8 times to stop that occurring, which reduces the number of wealthy people coming into Singapore. What's happened since 2008 is reminiscent of what happened after the 1929 crash when this cartoon was drawn. Just add 2 noughts and put 1 woman in there and change the hats, and you've got now. Except the difference, the big difference between 1929 and now is that that man at the top has actually stepped up. Those 1,000 richest families have doubled their wealth since 2008. Inequality amongst 99% of people has reduced since 2008 because of losing child benefit and because the full cuts haven't yet come in at the bottom, back to the level it was in 1992, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. It's only the 1% moving away at the moment that means that we are becoming still more unequal. You're told that we are a high tax and spending country. You were told this in the budget this year. I don't know, if you want to answer me a question, not now, but later, I don't know how you can say this. You know, unless maybe if you do a history degree, nobody actually tells you anything about numbers and big ones and small ones and lying. Here's figures from the IMF on public spending as a proportion of GDP. The lines start in 2015 and 2019 is where the IMF thinks they'll go, given each country's current plans. And at the top, you've got these completely failed countries, you know, Finland, Denmark, France, who'd want to live there, where they tax and spend 55% of their income for the public good, and you go to university in Denmark and you don't pay anything. You don't just not pay anything. You get a year to do work experience, like to be an intern, and the state pays you a very decent salary to be an intern. It's a different world. We go down Italy, Belgium, Austria, Sweden, Norway, Slovenia, around about 50%. Most European countries will tax you at around about 50p in the pound at around 50,000 euros. Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Portugal, Iceland, Greece. So we're beginning to get countries where things have gone wrong. And you can see the drop in public spending that Greece is having to do because of the Troika telling it has to behave in that way. That's the kind of thing that got Syriza elected. Got Syriza elected twice, even though they said they weren't going to do it, and then they're going to do it. Then you got Malta, which has only just managed to join the First World. It's one of about 3 countries that joined the First World in the last 50 years. And then, of course, then we've got Cyprus still. We've got some more, sorry. Czech Republic, Spain, not doing well, Estonia. Finally, you get to us. And we're supposedly a high tax and spending country. What Osborne did when he said that is he compared us to average countries in the world. Right? Rich countries are more equal. They are amongst the most equitable countries in the world. If you look at poorer countries, one of the most equal of poorer countries is China, and it's as unequal as the USA in terms of its income distribution. Greater equality is something that rich countries get before poor countries, apart from Cuba, Kerala, and Costa Rica. So that's where we are. But we could be worse. We could be the Slovak Republic. We could be doing what Ireland is doing, again, doing what the Troika in Germany wants it to do. Or, and this isn't fanciful, I just always plot everything that's in the data set because people claim you're fixing it otherwise. San Marino. I'll just bear San Marino and Singapore in mind as I come to the end of this. It's not all our fault, the reason we're so unequal. The fastest way to become more equal is to lose a war. That's how Japan became the most equal rich country in the world. That's why Germany was in such a good position, because when you lose a war, your elite are the ones who lose the most. Some people argue for inequality. They often argue it quietly, but they talk about tall poppies, being efficient, not holding back the best, winning the global race, these kind of things. Other people don't argue as well against inequality, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s in this country. People in the Netherlands were arguing that no child should die on the road in the Netherlands anymore at this time. And I'll show you later what they got as a result of that. You can have things that appear to be fairly structural until they go away, like racism in the USA or our class system now. But our class system was kind of going away when we became more equal. It's coming back with a vengeance now. There are deep ethnic divisions in places like Israel and Singapore. In most of the world, the reason why most countries are very unequal in the world is simply poverty. Most countries are still very poor. Right? But also, we don't know what the consequences of this are. It's kind of, so what? Okay, the figures look a bit shocking, but somebody's got to be the most unequal country in Europe, you know? And we're good at things. We're good at bands and nightclubs, and we're good at inventing things, because we invent lots of things, like Hoovers. But I think the most important thing is we don't realise the effects of this. I'll probably upset some people now. I'm just going to show you a few possible effects. Doesn't mean that one thing's causing the other. It almost certainly means that there's something else intervening. But as we now have a Shadow Secretary of State who's a vegan, I thought I'd put in meat eating. We eat twice as much meat a year as Japan, but dramatically less than the United States. It's not because we get out of bed in the morning and go, I just check the inequality index, you know, and then I'm going to go to McDonald's. It's because we have more McDonald's, and we have more advertising, and so on. And of course, there are countries where they just have a lot of meat. Yeah. So these things don't always line up. CO2. Consumption in general. I'm not going to show you the amount we consume. We measure consumption simply by measuring the weight of stuff in your bins. That's how we know how much you've bought. And that lines up. But more unequal countries, people pollute more, they buy more, they spend more, they get into more debt. They're encouraged to do that because society is about, well, just trying to be like the people just above you. And in a more unequal country, the people above you are just a little bit further above you than in a more equal country. A bit more tenuous, topical, I guess, if you're worried about diesel. So not everything is good in Germany, but it will spread. But these things matter for the future of the planet. And it's not because the United States is a big country. The United States has chosen to go for the car. Right? Other countries chose to go for trains. There's lots and lots about health and inequalities. Infant mortality reacts quite quickly to social conditions, and it lines up fairly well. You could say, well, you know, when I was a child, it was 11 per thousand, so 7's good. But 7's unnecessary. It's not necessary to have that number of babies dying, and it's just the tip of an iceberg. The much, much bigger thing is our levels of poor mental health, which are staggeringly different according to this index. You can look at measures of trust. Would you leave a bag on the train when you go to the toilet and ask somebody to look after it who you didn't know? Like a little into a secret. Almost always your bag will be fine, right? It will. But if you live in a more unequal country, you're less likely to believe that and to trust a stranger. If you live in a more equal country, when we ask people, or actually get them to behave in certain ways, they behave in ways that reveals that their trust is higher. We don't understand each other as well in unequal countries because we don't mix. A pro-vice-chancellor in Sheffield tried to convince me that his children mixed in the nightclubs in Sheffield. But even our nightclubs are now class segregated between students, rich students, locals, and where occasionally locals might want to meet students. You can actually get a license to study nightclubs and buy drugs, by the way, from the Home Office, if you're my age, because you look like you are drug squad. Exam results become ever more important in more unequal countries. I'll get onto that in a bit. And I'm going to look at ability in mathematics. And in a way, this relates to the title. I didn't know this when I gave you the title. But I think it's interesting. You can do all kinds of other tests. You can ask people whether they think their children will be in the 1%, and you find a quarter of Americans think their children will be in the 1%. In more equal countries, people are better at working out. All those are you an over average driver questions. Are you better looking than average? These are lovely questions that populations of the world are asked. And in more unequal countries, people are much more likely to boost themselves up. But here's simple ability in maths. Maths is something that you can test quite well because it's much the same. And as the inequality rises, the ability of the population to add up and take away reduces, and you've got a relationship. And there we are. We're not very good at maths. Singapore, very good. Japan, pretty good. But it looks a bit weak, doesn't it? So this is the thing that really shocked me. Think about your maths, and think about when you were 18. I'll just do a little test. Who got an A star? Go on. Are you really over? Okay. Who got an A at GCSE? Or O level, if you're my age? Who got a B? Well done. Who got a C? And then who was a failure? Oh, we are in an unequal country. You don't admit somebody won't. That is interesting, isn't it? Not the end of the world if you know. The good news, if you didn't get an A, B, or C, is that all those people who did get one didn't actually learn much maths. Right? Okay. This is fascinating. I mean, it's almost too good to be true. This is what the OECD found a couple of years ago. It's published in 2013. When they tested people at the ages between 16 and 24 at their maths ability. And it's just stunning. So what did we do in the United Kingdom? Think about your maths or children's maths if you're my age. We coached them to get an A or a C if you're working class. A if you're middle class, C if you're working class. We teach them what they need to know to do well in that exam, but we don't teach them maths because we're a highly competitive country and competition is good and you have to measure it unless you actually want to learn maths. And it might just be sensible to think that there is a reason why if the population was better at maths, other things might work better. The last one of these, it's not causation, it's something else going on. This is the proportion of people who walk or cycle to work, 50% in the Netherlands, where they decided in the 1970s that they didn't want their children being killed on the roads anymore, 3.5% in the USA. Right? It's not because people get up in the Netherlands and decide that they're going to cycle that day. It is because you have a society that decides it's going to arrange workplaces and housing and going to separate traffic and it's going to paint cycle lanes and it's going to do everything else you have to do if you want people not to sit in a car, which is the second best way of getting fat other than eating lots of stuff. So when you look at the correlation, which I haven't shown you, between obesity and inequality, which is there as well, you have to think about car use and inequality, and you have to think about eating and inequality. And the reason why this is interesting or a shock, and the reason why nobody's drawn that maths graph until 2 weeks ago, is because this is new, because we've got to the end of the experiment and we can begin to measure the outcomes and see what happens. Last graph. I hope it's the last graph. If you remember that original curve, in what the 1% take, and how it was very high and then it went down and now it's gone up again. This is a similar curve for politics. This is the segregation index of the Conservative Party. We often work out segregation index for ethnic minority groups or for students. You know, how many students would you have to move across the country not to have students so ghettoized? This is a percentage of Conservative voters that you'd have to move between constituencies. The smallest number you'd have to move at each general election from 1918 onwards if you wanted to get an even distribution of Conservative voters everywhere. The vote was very polarised between different places in the past. It was connected to religions and other things. It came down. When it goes too low, it doesn't necessarily help you in elections because you've got your voters everywhere, like the Greens. It's fairly, you get one seat in Brighton. And then it jumped up in 1974. South East of England voted Conservative in February 1974. They didn't get a Conservative MP, Prime Minister. It dropped back down slightly to 79, and then it went up and up and up and up and up, and led me to think before the election this year that it was going to be ever so hard for the Conservatives to win the election outright because their votes were getting more and more polarised into the same places, into Surrey, into the leafy home counties. And lo and behold, I got my call on the election wrong. I'm just glad everybody else did. But I didn't get my call on saying the polarisation would rise wrong. We had 3 elections worth of polarisation in one election. It was stunning. It just so happens that there were quite a lot of Tories in those seats of the southwest already. So when you got a few more and wiped out the Liberals, it didn't take a huge number of people. It just so happens that Scotland doesn't matter one bit because the last Conservative left Scotland about then. So that has nothing to do with Scotland at all. This is all about increased polarisation in England. And it means you've got to a point when only 1 in 4 of the electorate have actually voted Conservative and won an outright majority. I don't think there has been any election in demographic history, and somebody hopefully is going to send me an email and tell me why I'm wrong, when 1 in 4 of the electorate have managed to do this before. It's fluke, it's partly chance, it is not Linton Crosby. The nearest you can get to is the United States, where half the population doesn't vote for the president. But the president still needs 27 or 28% of the electorate in the United States. I won't go on about it. It's just a fascinating position you get into when you get this polarised. So you have areas where everybody doesn't vote or votes Labour and a few Greens. If you go 10 miles from where I live into the countryside, you can turn around and touch a Tory. You know, that's what it is. Or, you know, maybe if they're really radical, they might have been a Liberal. But people will vote, because you do vote. Our areas are becoming more distinctive. It gets easier to stereotype people over time. That cartoon was drawn a long time ago, when people began to get angry about inequalities rising. That graph was drawn by George Monbiot just before ONS pulled the data off their website. ONS pulled the data off their website because they might have underestimated this. It might actually be. Once you put the richest 1,000 families in, the average wealth of the 1% is a bit higher than just 15 million or whatever it was. Right? This is not a normal country to live in. That is the country we are now living in. I think we've reached the end of an experiment. I do believe you could have looked at it theoretically in the 70s and 80s and said, this could work. It could make everybody better off. It could pull people up from their bootstraps and the inefficient rich will fall down. It just hasn't worked. We could try, if you think of San Marino or Singapore, we could try trickle down in one country. Trickle down no longer works, we know, worldwide. You can't have the richest 1% in the world owning half of the planet and increasing that by 7 percentage points a year at the moment, which tells you it's going to end. You know that trickle down doesn't work generally, but you could keep low property taxes in this country, be the most popular place in the world for billionaires to live, which we already are, try and get the other third of billionaires who don't yet have 2 flats in London to buy them, get more and more overseas students paying 20, 25, 30, why not £45,000 a year as a master's course in something, and buy a flat while you're at it. We could go for trickle down in one country, a safe haven for the rich. It is an option. And our children could be servants again. Or we may be beginning to think that the experiment failed. Now, the last time this happened was after the First World War. It was a long time ago. People often say that was a world war. You have to have something as devastating as a world war and a Russian Revolution to change things. It was a world war for us. It wasn't actually a world war for most of the world. It was a small, very, very deadly European war. What happened was not that people changed their minds after the First World War. Right? Young people changed their minds. Vera Brittain changed her mind. And after the 1929 crash, the bankers didn't change their minds. They tried to revert in 1931 and 33 back to what they had before. It was the young who decided that they didn't believe their parents anymore, didn't find them trustworthy. And then when their parents sent them off into another bigger war, you know, you really have lost the trust. But what could the equivalent of that be? It mainly has to happen to the United States. It's the United States which is leading inequality. So you've got to think of things that are unusual in the United States. Have we got anything which is cataclysmic or worrying? And you could think, well, we might just be burning the planet up. And where are they burning the planet up more per head than anywhere else? It is the United States. Who's going to be most affected when you can no longer get that much oil out of the ground for all those cars? Or it could be the fact that since the 1970s, we've had a slowdown in our fertility rates worldwide. So we had peak baby in 1990. We're about to get another billion people in the next 12 years, but that's because people are not dying anymore. Not because we're actually having more babies. We're having less and less babies. At some point in the next 80 years, I think maybe 50 years, the population of the planet is set to start to decline. It already is declining in Japan. It already is declining in a large number of parts of Europe. Over half the world is below fertility level. And why does this matter? Because if you've got a business model that has only ever worked in places with population expansion, where you can make a profit every year because you've got more consumers every year, that doesn't work if you have population slowdown. Or it could be mass education. It could be the fact that we now send half of all young women to university in this country. The majority job for your grandmothers and great-grandmothers was to be a servant. That was the modal occupation, the most likely occupation. Can you send half of young women to university and tell them that they want to be servants for the super rich of the world in future? Possibly, but I find it hard. And worldwide, if you look at the rise in literacy, it is just stunning, and the rise in access to the internet. Or it could be something, it's almost certainly something we don't predict. It could be the fact, I don't know, how many of you do your diaries on a phone? And that, electronically? Or who doesn't? Who's still got a paper diary? That's the other way around. Oh, you are traditional. Okay, well, you're safe. Yeah, one day they're not going to sync. Anyway, that's my favourite one. Or more likely, think of the rising position of women over the last century. Women were absolutely subhuman a century ago. Are we going to carry on doing the same thing when more women are in positions of power than men? And you might say that's not going to happen. But 50% of your women are going to university, only about 36% of men in countries like this one. We've got no idea what it's going to be. It could be the fact that all the debts cannot be repaid. We know the student debts can't be repaid, but nobody knows what the size of the PFI debts are. There's numerous things it could be, but I think it's most likely to be what it was before, which is a younger generation deciding that their parents' generation had made a very big mistake and vowing not to replicate that mistake as they got older. I think that's where the hope lies in what's going to happen, and we're not going to be idiots in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Danny, very much. We have some time for questions and some roving mics. There's no compunction to, but if you'd like to introduce yourself to Danny before you ask the question, I'm sure we'd be delighted to make your acquaintance. So do we have any questions?
You can always pretend you're somebody that you're not.
Yeah.
You know,
Over there.
You might be able to hear me like that.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the relation between immigration and inequality?
Yes.
And where do people go?
It's positive. So in general, the greater the inequality in the rich world, the higher the immigration. So the US has the highest immigration. This is net. Somewhere like New Zealand has an incredible 20% come in and 20% leave kind of turnover. It's high in unequal countries like ours because there are lots of places at the bottom, mainly because there are lots of really low-paying jobs. Think about Mexicans in California. People move around the world a bit like billiard balls. You know, they move around at an incredible rate. You can't stop them. What matters, you can build fences and you just get a different set of people. You get more fit young men. It has no effect on the numbers, immigration control and border controls. What matters are the holes and the availability to stay around and to be there. And unequal countries have an incredible number of jobs that people don't want to do, like picking fruit. You know, these kind of things that we make people do in this country. There are also more opportunities at the top in unequal countries. So if you look at the Sunday Times Rich list, the Queen is, I don't know, number 60 now. You know, and she's only just British, you know, herself. So you get more immigrants coming in at the top and the bottom. In a more equal country, the opportunities at the bottom are far less because you don't create jobs that you're not going to pay enough money to, so people want to do a lot more of the jobs. The opportunities at the top are far, far less. There are fewer people paid, I think it's over £1 million a year in Japan, than are paid over £1 million in the Barclays Bank headquarters in Canary Wharf. Yeah. So you don't get that level of immigration. What you often get is an argument saying the inequality is due to immigration, but it's the other way around. And occasionally you get countries like Sweden opening up, despite the fact that they're very equal. There's also a very strong relationship with fertility rates. So the more equal the rich country is, the less babies people have per head. The more unequal, the more babies. We're about 1.8, 1.9 per couple, but only thanks to the immigration. And very quickly, people who come in adapt to the level that the populations already there have. Only the United States managed to produce more than 2 babies per couple, and that's even stopped now. All these things are linked. They're not causal, but they're just, and the relationships are dramatic. They are 2 babies rather than 1.3 babies. When you're on 1 baby a couple, you're talking about halving of population in a generation. What you need is a very large number of skilled young people coming into your continent very, very fast, which is what we've currently got.
Thank you. Up here, I think.
At least one or two of the slides indicated that since 2000, 2001, there was an exponential increase in inequality, at least in the UK. And so which kind of historical events do you think might have influenced this, and which role might have taken also 9/11 in this?
Could 9/11 be part of it? I think it's more the historical event is 1986 and the Big Bang. It's just that 1986 and the Big Bang didn't have an immediate effect in 1987, but that deregulation by the year 2000, 2001 was feeding through to allow inequality to rise and rise and rise. A Labour Party that had been captured by a particular tendency, so that when it came into power in 1997, actually didn't change things around very much. You really are then masters of the universe. If your Labour Party are turning up in black tie at the Mansion House talking about how good you are, you've kind of won. You might as well let rip and the salaries can go higher and higher. And of course, you've got to remember there's no 5th option. The idea of living on the dole was got rid of. The beginnings of being tough on people happened under that. Because as you become more unequal, all your political parties move to the right, but they all think they're being normal. As you become more unequal, as you become more equal, the opposite happens. So the Conservative Party in the 1950s was trying to build more council houses than the Labour Party had managed to do. That was the way you competed. And they change. But I don't think there was a particular thing around the millennium. I think it was earlier. By the millennium, we were beginning to see the repercussions of it. It's also not surprising, I think, that things haven't immediately changed with 2008, because they didn't immediately change with the First World War or 1929. People didn't actually know they were making a more equal world at that time. They were just very angry and you had mass unemployment. And the rich were fearful of insurrection and revolution. When you're at a tipping point, because it's gradual, it doesn't feel like a tipping point. The same with the 1970s. People thought that Margaret Thatcher was that would be just one election, it was an aberration, and then we'd be back to these old men who would sit down and have beer and sandwiches with the unions again. You really don't know at that point that you're at that point, and you've got no way of telling for 10 or 20 years. So you have to agitate, because there's a great danger you may not be at that point. There isn't an iron law that just says if you're about to become the most unequal country in the richest 25 countries in the world, because the only way is down, the only thing is greater equality. We could become the treasure island for the super rich of the world. We're in the right time zone, we've got some nice old buildings, we could sell them some heritage, pliant population that knows how to queue. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't have that lack of faith in people's ability. It isn't in my interests if this happens. I'm a well-paid university professor in a very elite institution, and it isn't in my interest if we become more unequal, because I've got children. And even if you take all my wealth, because I've got a mortgage, which means one day I'll get some wealth, you know, you can't cut my wealth up and give my children enough deposit to let them actually be able to buy a place, because I made the mistake of having more than one child. You know, so even if I only care about myself and my family, sod the rest of society, you know, sod whether we're going to get more crime and whether the schools will get worse. Even if I'm being utterly selfish, for somebody like me, it is not even in my interest to want us to become a safe haven for the rich of the world.
Here first, then gentlemen here.
Danny, you've done a great analysis and shown the things which are wrong and where they went wrong. You've also predicted some external and perhaps some internal events which could start to change that for the future. But for many people, we actually want to influence things now, acting as catalysts for the right sort of change.
Yeah.
What do you see? Is it higher taxes, greater public spending, or what?
Okay, I'll give you three very quickly. The immediate thing is to register to vote. And the reason you need to know is it's a shock. Your vote is not that important, because you probably live in a constituency where it won't change who wins. But if you register to vote in the next 4 or 5 weeks, you will be on the electoral roll when they take a snapshot of the roll in November and use it to redraw the constituency boundaries. There are millions of students who have decided, well, they haven't decided, they've just turned up at halls of residence in the last few weeks. Right? Why would you bother to register to vote now if there's not going to be an election? All those university towns lose part of a constituency. 25% of families privately renting, do you think they bother to go on the electoral roll? Now, you do get a form, but that form can have been delivered any time from August, I think, through to October. I said 3 things, I'll be quick about it. I live in Oxfordshire. We have 6 parliamentary constituencies, 5 return to Conservative, 1 returns Labour. We have a very large number of people who are not on the roll because we have a high turnover population in Oxford. They're all sitting in the area which is a 50% Labour voting area. Get them on the roll by November and you've got 2 seats without anybody voting Labour. That's your first one. Longer term, higher marginal taxes. Just aim for the middle European marginal tax rate. It's not dramatic. It's not even 60%. Higher marginal tax rates help the bosses of affluent people not succumb to their pay demands because you have to give more money to the Treasury. They're just useful for that. It's not about raising money. It's about helping people who are already well paid not feel they need to get even more. It would help if the housing market calmed down. The fastest way to make the vast majority of the population better off is if housing costs fall. If your rent fell by 1 or 2% a year, that's like every trade union winning their pay claims, right? So that would be good. And little things, small things that you can argue for. My favourite is 20-mile-an-hour zones. You know, it sounds very odd when I say this, but the biggest killer of people between the ages of 5 and 24 in the country, and the biggest danger to elderly people, is still roads. If you argue for 20 mile an hour in your city, it shows you can actually do something, but it's also about a collective way of behaving. You're saying a few selfish people who really feel the need to drive at 35 or 40 through a 30 mile an hour zone, which is a killing speed, you're not going to put up with them. And all of these things matter. And just opening your mouth at Christmas when it's slightly uncomfortable and saying, you know, that Jeremy Corbyn, you know, he is a bit odd, but, you know, it is nice sometimes to get a leader saying, I wouldn't be prepared to be a mass murderer. You know, and I know it's strange to do that, but yeah, doesn't mean he's the solution. It's about moving an envelope. What has to happen is the envelope of what's okay needs to move. I think Jeremy Corbyn is brilliant cover for another generation who would have done very badly had they suddenly come to power in 5 years' time after another Labour defeat. The Owen Joneses. You know, I think they could have been ripped apart. Whereas now they look sane.
You mentioned the political parties moving to the right.
where is social sciences now in the academic world?
Ah. Well, we've always tended to be pretty left, apart from one social science. If you, which was in the past more left. If you really wanted to make your name for yourself as a social scientist, just being a right-wing sociologist or a right-wing geographer would do it. You'd be so unusual. Then the exception is economics, and economics got tied up with the experiment. And theoretically, the experiment was interesting, and on paper, it kind of should work. It just takes out human emotion. It takes out the fact we're animals who react to how much we're respected by others, and the main form of respect is money. Economics is now going through a very painful process. It is as hard as if medics have suddenly found out that smoking is good for you, right? And you can see, I think you should have some sympathy for what happens to a discipline who fought, and particularly the American-dominated part of that discipline, who really thought they were becoming a science, and leading us to a brave new world, of the end of history. And it's a shock, and that's the interesting discipline to watch in the social sciences.
Adam.
Perhaps I'm the exception who proves your rule, but I'm an economist, and I'm also happen to be president of the branch of UCU at Manchester University.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you whether, with that hat on, you see any role for trade unions in this process of, over time, reducing inequality. I'm thinking in particular of Tony Atkinson's book on inequality, just this year, was it last year?
Yeah.
Where part of his story is about the declining role or power of trade unions since the 1980s. He talks about the huge, what he describes himself as being astonishing amount of anti-trade union restricting legislation that was being passed since the 1980s.
Yeah.
Trade unions, of course, are not highly popular today, I'm afraid. But part of his argument is that if there is to be any improvement or reduction in inequality, perhaps part of that might be a improvement in the countervailing power, as he calls it, or as J.K. Galbraith called it, of trade unions. Do you agree with that? Do you have any views on that?
I agree with half of it. So the more equal countries tend to have more trade unionists, the more unequal tend to have far fewer. The more trade unionists you've got, the more equal your country will tend to be. In Britain, the trade unions have not been that brilliant for equality because they've been arguing up their own workers' salaries and often trying to protect the differential, which is keep the inequalities what they are. And I'll never forget being at the TUC and the Airline Pilots Union defending to me the $250,000 salaries of the Qantas pilots, saying that they were the vanguard of the working class. That was, and if you can keep them on $250,000, everybody else will be fine. But we are getting a rise in trade union membership again because people are scared for their jobs. If you look at FE colleges, the quiet thing is join a union if you're an FE college, because when they sack somebody from the union, that's when everybody walks out. The sad thing is they're going to sack the people who are not joining the unions. But increased precarity will increase the membership. However, my worry is that we look back at things that worked really well in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So we look back at the building and council estates. We look back at trade unions. We look back at the nationalisation of a health service. We look at solutions that worked well in the past. And we say, if only we could do that again, we'd be okay in the future. And what we don't do is the leap of imagination that says, somebody in 1910 said that it might be a good idea if our children didn't have to pay for school. And maybe one day they could go to the nearest school and they could all go to the same one. And it was a new thing. And somebody said it would be great to get rid of the slums and we'll build some state housing, but it was new. And I think where progressive politics is really lacking is what is the new and different thing rather than the recreation of the old. With trade unions or with workers' rights, it could be something just like if you know the Athena Swan process, which began in medicine. You can't get grants in the medical department now if you don't show you supposedly care about how you treat women in your department. And it happened to medicine and science. But these kind of processes whereby people worry about discrimination inside the workplace has happened without unions, but becomes more powerful. So I think what we need to do is look for the new ideas. And the problem is the new ideas, some of them will initially look as mad as the suggestion that all children could go to the same school and not pay for it. You know, what about the special children who should go to that special school? The world will end if that doesn't happen. And you'll get the same with something that turns out to be sensible and might even happen. You know, in my town, why don't we shut down another 5 roads in the middle and stop the cars going in there? Oh, you must be mad to do that, people say. And I say, but I've gone back to my town after being away for 30 years, and I've noticed you've shut lots of roads down that people 30 years ago said couldn't possibly be pedestrianised. So we need a whole mixture, and the MAD is good because it moves that envelope. And part of the reason why the right did so well in British politics is that they had outriders who were arguing for things that were so ridiculous that the mainstream of the Conservative Party looked like a normal Conservative Party, just not one that can actually join the other Conservative parties of Europe because it's so extreme.
Okay, I think we'll call it to a stop there. We've worked Danny hard enough. Thanks very much indeed.